Here we continue our examination of the Soviet Union under the Brezhnev regime, more specifically looking at foreign policy, more specifically looking at the relationship with the West, more specifically looking at this reversion to Cold War after a period of detente. And if you look at the image that is in the screen, it is President Reagan of the US announcing the Star Wars program, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And if you look in the back, the image behind President Reagan, it is the Soviet installation of long-range missiles in Cuba, which foreshadows a whole bunch of stuff. So you've seen these learning objectives before. We continue looking at the aims of Russia's foreign policy. And we will, through this, we're also going to understand the relationship with the West. In this video, we're going to look at the change in direction from detente to Cold War that happened with the West. And then, of course, understand the success, analyze the success, reasons for, and the impact that these policies are going to have domestically. So in 1979, the Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is strategically important because it is close to massive oil-producing regions. So, of course, the strategic importance of that. And then, as you can see, Afghanistan borders 3, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, of the Soviet Socialist republics. And so for the Soviet Union, the invasion of Afghanistan was to try to stop the invasion, the potential invasion of fundamentalist Islam into these regions that are also have large Muslim populations, and from there entering into other parts of Russia. And so the idea is that to try to stop this problem before it becomes a huge problem for Russia domestically. Quickly, I'm going to discuss the background to the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. In 1978, the Afghan government was overthrown in a coup d'etat by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And the PDPA is leaning toward communism and towards the Soviet Union. So they are pro-Russian and they're in power, but they control the cities, but they have difficulty controlling the rural areas. And we know Afghanistan is a huge country and there are so many crenellations of mountains and places that people can hide and so on and so forth. So they're having a lot of difficulty controlling the areas between the cities. And so they're constantly being harried by Afghan nationalists who support the previous government and the Islamic Mujahideen who don't support this whole communism, anti-religious aspect of the PDPA. And so they asked the Soviet Union for help, and in December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to help the PDPA. And although we can say that the Soviet Union had legitimate reasons to be concerned about the coup and the resulting situation in Afghanistan, it ultimately turns out to be a very bad situation for them in terms of their international standing. Iran and Pakistan denounced the USSR for getting involved, and other countries in the Muslim world also denounce the USSR. So essentially, a number of the friends that they had made in the Middle East are now turning their backs on the Soviet Union. The US is going to respond with military help for the rebels. So they're going to provide weapons and advisors to help them better fight against the PDPA and the Soviet Union. There is a call for a boycott of the 1980 Olympics, and a significant number of countries, including the US and Canada, I think Australia, so on and so forth, they do not participate. So this is egg in the face of the Soviet Union. And At this time, during this time, the SALT II discussions were going on, and this was a continuation of SALT I in terms of limiting nuclear proliferation and other military expansion. So, purpose of limiting the arms race, that stops. The U.S. is very angry and stops. There is a U.S. embargo on grain and technology to the Soviet Union. And one of the things, if you remember from the economic stuff, the Soviet Union pretty much always needed to supplement the food of the people by importing grain from the U.S. And this is going to have a domestic impact of increasing the price of goods in the U.S. And of course, one of the purposes of detente with the West was to have access to that U.S. That technology. And so now they lose all of that. So in a way, you kind of look at Afghanistan, it's just like, was it worth it? Because as stated at the beginning, a number of the things that they do actually seems to contradict each other and undermine the goals of the other policies. NATO begins deployment of intermediate missiles in Western Europe, and so this, of course, creates even more tension between the two and increases that feeling of insecurity. And mostly people say that this was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They have over 50,000 casualties, and this war cost a huge amount of money at a time when they could little afford to spend that money. As you know, there are economic issues, blah, 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 happening at this time. And basically, this Khrushchev ends really, really bitter about this. Basically, he says, not a day goes by when Washington has not tried to revive the spirit of the Cold War to heat up militarist passions. Any grounds are used for this, real or imagined. One example of this is Afghanistan. So that's a quote from Brezhnev. And, you know, even China gets involved as well, and to undermine the Soviet Union, and is providing support for the rebels and the Mujahideen. And if you look, here is a handy-dandy map of the boycotts of the Olympics during this time. And so one of the things that was happening is that the states would use the boycotts as a way of exhibiting their displeasure. There is the recognition that these various sides have nuclear weapons, and sort of like the zero-sum game of using nuclear technology. So they would instead use other things like the boycotts. And you can see from 76, 80, and 84, there were a number of states that were participating in the boycotts. So, as we've previously said, that the invasion of Afghanistan is the impetus, the spark that leads to the Second Cold War after this period of detente. And it doesn't end until 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev comes into power, and he is more reform-oriented. So this Second Cold War begins with the end of the SALT II negotiations. They had been negotiating since like 1972 to come to an agreement about weapons proliferation. And basically that many years, 7 years worth of work, is down the drain. And so the other thing that is changing at this time is Ronald Reagan is elected as president of the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher is the prime minister of the UK. And both of these guys are very anti-communist. They're not in terms of like placating or having that sort of peaceful coexistence thing. And so this is going to change their attitude toward the Soviet Union. And here we have a quote by Ronald Reagan, and he says, "Their society is economically weak, and it lacks the wealth, education, and technology to enter the information age. They have thrown everything into military production, and their society is starting to show terrible stress as a result. They can't sustain military production the way we can. Eventually, it will break them. And then there will be just one superpower in a safe world. If, only if, we can keep spending. So this was sort of like Ronald Reagan's foreign policy idea about the on the relationship with the Soviet Union. And he said this in 1984. And once we look at what happens with Gorbachev, you will see that this really did come to pass. And so basically you have, again, increased military spending on part of the U.S., which is going to result in the same on part of the Soviet Union. And one of the biggest things that the U.S. implements, it was kind of cray-cray back then, and it was called the Star Wars program. This wasn't the official designation, but this is what people called it in the media because it just seems so scientific, like science fiction oriented, right? So in the Star Wars program, it was about creating sort of like this network of anti-ballistic missile protection thing, as well as being able to launch those as well. And it included like laser and chemical warfare, and it included sending satellites into space that could fight each other with lasers, or would be able to shoot missiles launched from the Soviet Union from space. Yeah, hence Star Wars. Star Wars was incredibly expensive for the US. It was a huge, huge debt. But it was more expensive for the Soviet Union.